We'd like to welcome our reporters panel now for some political analysis. Dan Balls is the chief correspondent for the Washington Post. Ed O'Keefe is the political correspondent right here at CBS News. Shannon Pettypiece is a White House reporter for Bloomberg News, and Mark Landler covers the White House and foreign policy for the New York Times. So, Ed, I'll start with you. Did you hear any points of agreement, or were Democrats and Republicans just talking past each other on the show?
Two of their best spokespeople were talking past each other this morning, yes, and I think elsewhere as well. Look, the staff meetings that are happening this weekend that the vice president is chairing is usually the kind of thing you see on maybe day 2 or day 3 of a shutdown. We can forgive the holidays, we can forgive the fact that people weren't in town, maybe that's the delay, but what are we on, day 16 now? And this continues to stretch out, and given that they're still at that very preliminary point where they're still only beginning to define what border security means to everybody, where they're still defining how $5.7 billion would be spent, we got a ways to go. Congress doesn't get back till Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. That would suggest that you got to have meetings and maybe some initial votes. I'm thinking a week from today, government's probably still shuttered, unless something urgent suddenly arises that forces them to move faster.
You had Senator Durbin saying he doesn't see a way to get to $5 billion. You had Senator Graham saying no wall, no deal. Is there any point of agreement anywhere in here, Dan?
There's not at this point, other than that both sides believe in border security. And,
whatever that means.
Frankly, so whatever that means. And I think it is remarkable that we have gone now 2+ weeks, and there has been absolutely no indication of where the negotiating could actually take place. Every time they sit down, they seem to be farther away than they were and more dug in. It feels as though each side still believes that this can be a win-lose proposition. You know, I win, you lose. Right. That's never the way these kinds of things end, and we'll see whether this is a different situation.
Well, and the cynics would say it's not just me winning or losing. This is all campaign 2020 that they're gesturing towards, that immigration is one of those issues that divides people, but it makes them emotional and fired up as well. Is that actually a conversation about border security, or is it a conversation about politics?
Well, there is certainly a lot of politics in this, because we know that for President Trump, the wall has been central to his political message. And I know there are Democrats who believe that he will never make a deal because he wants the issue more than he wants the wall, if you will. And so that's part of the hump that you have to get over in these negotiations. But with the government shut down, there's going to have to be a solution at some point. I mean, this can't go on indefinitely. The president talked about this could go on for months or even years. It's not going to go on for years. We're confident of that. But the question is how long each side is prepared to hold out. And I think what we'll get to at some point, I don't know when, is there will be enough, if you will, pain and suffering and complaints and issues that pop up as a result of the hardships caused by government being shut down that will eventually force a solution.
Shannon, I mean, is that the calculus? We didn't really hear answers from either of the senators about what to do about these hundreds of thousands of American workers who are waiting for paychecks.
Right. At this point, both sides think they have a winning hand politically. No one is facing any real political pressure. And part of that, again, the holidays, people weren't really paying that much attention. But for the White House, they see this good politically. Democrats, they're not really feeling any political pain at this point. So that changes at the end of this coming week, when federal employees start missing their first paycheck. There are services people will start noticing, getting your passport renewed, going to a national park on the weekend. So then you get the political pressure starting to ratchet up. But because the sides are so far apart, I don't think this ends without one side caving under political pressure. And right now, no one's feeling it, so it goes on, and there's no urgency.
Mark, one of the other things that may not be breaking through but is a big headline today is the National Security Advisor in Israel making an announcement that seems to be yet another change in the Syria policy. The president said he was pulling troops out in 30 days. Then we stretched it out to 120 days. Now what's being described as a total indefinite stay of U.S. troops in Syria. What are people at the Pentagon actually being told to do?
Well, it is interesting. It's as though we have come full circle from where we were on December 19th when President Trump announced this pullout and put a 30-day deadline on it. I think there's probably a great deal of confusion at the Pentagon, and I think it's not an accident that we have not seen a single 4-star general come out and speak publicly about what the strategy is in Syria. There's been a great lack of synchronicity between the White House and the Pentagon all along. The question I have now is, how in sync is the National Security Advisor with his own president? President Trump, just a few minutes ago on his way to Camp David, repeated what he has said over and over again. The troops are going to come out of Syria soon. That's a very different message than what John Bolton had in Israel a few hours earlier. Some of the caveats that he put in place, namely the one that we would not pull out our troops if there was any threat that the Turks would go after our Kurdish allies, that is by all accounts a standard that cannot be met at all in the short term. I think a lot of people in the Pentagon are skeptical the Turks can ever be relied on not to go after the Kurds. So I think that we're really in a moment of deep confusion about where this policy goes. But I have to say it is in keeping with what we've seen from President Trump on troop deployment and withdrawal issues almost from the beginning of his presidency. He will say something dramatic, indicate a desire, determination to pull out, and then as the machinery of the national security apparatus kind of grinds on, the timetables suddenly slow down. It's a lot more complicated. His words meet reality on the ground, and I think that's the moment we're at, but it must be a very confusing one for our allies and for our adversaries.
Yeah, it's not clear if the order has been given to troops to not pull out, because they had been ordered to pull out.
Indeed.
And we don't know who the Secretary of Defense will be either.
And that's a very interesting question, because a number of the obvious candidates for the defense secretary job are actually people who went on record fairly strongly against President Trump's troop pullout. Lindsey Graham being an obvious example. Tom Cotton expressed reservations about it as well. So some of those top-tier candidates don't appear to be on the same page. There are some other names that are being bandied about, but I'm beginning to sense that maybe filling the defense secretary job will be a little bit like filling the chief of staff job was, which, if you recall, a lot of people turned it down, and Mick Mulvaney only agreed to do it on an acting basis. I wouldn't be surprised if Pat Shanahan, the acting defense secretary, is someone we see in that job for quite a few more months.
And that would mean we wouldn't get to hear congressional hearings and on the record an explanation to the American people. More to talk about on the other side of this commercial break. We'll be right back in a moment. We're back now with more from our reporters panel. We saw this week campaign 2020 kick off, even though we just started 2019, Dan. And Elizabeth Warren, a senator, throwing her hat in the ring. How do you see Democrats defining themselves?
That is such an interesting question, because I think we are going to go through a period in which there is great hunger among Democratic activists to figure out who the best person is to take on President Trump in 2020. And I think there is such a range of opinions on who that will be. We saw in Iowa this weekend tremendous crowds that turned out for Elizabeth Warren. I think that is emblematic of the interest that people have and a desire to hear from the candidates. I think that people are approaching this with an open mind. We know this is going to be a very wide open race. There are a few people like Elizabeth Warren or Vice President Biden, Bernie Sanders, who have standing and networks and a certain amount of name identification, but there are all kinds of other people who are going to be in this with different kinds of messages. And my sense is that people are going to be reluctant to jump too quickly to one candidate and get behind that candidate. And they are going to say, as they all talk about at Iowa, they're going to kick those tires for some months as they watch and wait and listen to what people are doing.
So lots of exploring without declaring, Ed?
Yeah, Senator Warren was the second to do that, actually. Julian Castro, the former HUD secretary, was the first before Christmas, and will make it official next weekend. But where's everybody else, you might ask? And they are still mulling it. I think we have at least 7 Democratic senators who are thinking about it, some big city and small city mayors. Governor Inslee of Washington State said this week he's still thinking about it. So you will see in the coming weeks continued discussions about this, people saying, yeah, I'm still thinking about it. And lest you think it's just empty talk, I heard a story from somebody who met the former vice president at an event and said to him, my mother really wants you to run.
This is Biden?
This is Biden. And Biden said in response to her, what's her name? Give me her number. He had an aide get her phone number. The next day he called this woman's mother, and they talked for about 10 minutes. And he asked, so you think I should run? Yes, absolutely, you should. And if you do, I will volunteer for you. And he asked her all these reasons why. That happens, and they're all doing this. It's got to be tremendous for their ego. But whether or not it actually results in them running and taking the plunge, is another matter, because they have to factor in, can I stand up against somebody like Elizabeth Warren who has the name ID in the network? Can I somehow distinguish myself in a field that will feature numerous women, several different minority candidates? I have to find a way to play in the South. At the same time, I have to find a way to play in California and Georgia and all these other places because of early voting. It's going to be a tremendous competition, and one that I think a lot of people are surprised hasn't been joined by others yet, but I think that's because they realize this is going to be a tremendous exercise for them.
It sounds there, Shannon, like you're going to see some campaigning in the halls of Congress.
Oh, yeah.
Based on the rundown of candidates.
Yeah, well, I mean, and when you talk about this, meanwhile, at the White House, they are very clearly in 2020 mode. I mean, we could say they were in 2020 mode, 2 years ago today, but the White House is transitioning into 2020 mode. And while you have these Democrats who are exploring and making their first trip to Iowa, now you have a President Trump who has a real campaign infrastructure behind him. It's not the Trump Tower, papers flying all over the place, no one knowing who's in charge. They have an actual campaign. They have raised millions and millions of dollars. They have a big data operation. They are out of the gate and running, and the Democrats are still kind of trying to find where the starting line is or decide if they're going to show up at the race. So, I mean, that's what they're going to be up against. And they also feel like, despite how much criticism and how unpopular the president might be, they also feel like they have something really to run on. The whole slogan for 2020 is this: promises made, promises kept. You might not like the promises that he kept, but they are going to say that he did what he said he was going to do. He was not one of those politicians who came to Washington and did a flip-flop. He did what he said, and they feel like that's a strong hand to run on.
To your point about campaigning in Congress, that panel discussion you had with those freshman members, 3 of those 4 replaced Republicans and will go home in 2020 and run again in districts that favor Republican candidates. To watch those kinds of Democrats now in Congress twist in the wind as candidates go out and talk about a progressive tax rate, Medicare for all, agreeing with the president that maybe we should withdraw all our forces from Syria, it's going to be really difficult for a lot of these people to somehow make a mark here and somehow deal with the maybe 15, 20 people who are running for president in their party. And it's going to make things quite uncomfortable for them.
Mark, I mean, one of the things that, to pick up on what Shannon was saying, promises made, promises kept, that is something the president prides himself on doing. It has been a challenge for some of his aides, though, who say sometimes you need to change with the information flow when circumstances change. You can't just keep to the promise because it was part of the original brand. Afghanistan, when the president had that cabinet meeting in front of the cameras earlier this week, he made some unusual comments. And Wall Street Journal came down pretty hard on him.
Yeah, no, the president said in essence that the Soviet Union had been right to invade Afghanistan. He offered a series of reasons for that were not factually based. He said it was an anti-terrorism move. It really wasn't. And he also attributed the collapse of the Soviet Union to their misadventures in Afghanistan, which is not right. It's not totally wrong, but there were many other reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union. But to get back to the political point you were raising, I think the troop withdrawal debate is an interesting one, because it is true that he ran on withdrawing American troops from foreign conflicts. I think it's
So did Obama.
So did Obama, and so do, as you say, many Democrats. What I don't think has been tested, maybe at least I'd love to see it tested more, is just how resonant an issue getting out of foreign wars is for President Trump's base. We know where his base is on the border wall. We know that's why he's sticking to the wall so hard.
Yeah.
And I think that also explained his decision before Christmas to announce this troop withdrawal. I just would be interested to see a little more maybe research into how much his voters really care about pulling troops out.
Good question. We'll be right back.